Oh yes, it's Nick Shell. Well, here's the deal. I had some subscribers suggest this week that I start telling more stories about myself, about my personal life. So, okay, let's try this out. I had this concept, and here it is. I exist ultimately because my grandmother, my Mexican grandmother, 100% Mexican, did not speak Spanish. I think that is ultimately why I exist, and I want to explain why. So, my Mexican grandmother's parents moved here from, like, is it called Chicano Mexican? It's South Mexico. They moved straight to Buffalo, New York. And once my grandmother got into elementary school, they would not allow her to speak Spanish in their house. Only English, which was funny because they themselves couldn't really speak English, having just moved from Mexico. But they only allowed her to speak Spanish in the house. And what that forced her to do is it forced her to speak English very well. So when I think of my grandmother, and she just passed away 3 weeks ago at age 81, but when she passed away, the only accent she had was Buffalo, New York. It wasn't any kind of Hispanic or Mexican accent or Spanish or whatever you want to call it. She had none of that. And so here's why I think I exist ultimately because of that. So at age 18, she graduated high school. Around that time, she was writing letters to this Italian American called, his name was Albert Metello. And he was in the Korean War. And so they're writing letters back and forth, meaning that they both spoke very good English. And of course, with my grandfather, my Italian grandfather, his parents brought him here to America. But then he was raised in an orphanage with kids in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who all spoke English. So that's how he got a perfect, American accent, of course, but from Kenosha, Wisconsin. So you have these two first-generation Americans who spoke perfect English, ultimately because they weren't able to speak their own language that their own parents would have taught them, because my grandfather's mother passed away, which is why I had to go to the orphanage. So ultimately what we're looking at is my Mexican grandma's parents didn't allow her to speak Spanish in the house, and my Italian grandfather was raised in an orphanage because his mother passed away when he was young. So they ended up writing letters to each other. They ended up getting married. And of course, then my mom was born in Buffalo, moved down to the South in the 70s, met my dad, who's full American, from the South, and then I'm born, which means ultimately I don't really have an accent, even though I'm from the South. We had all that going on, and I was very close to both my Italian grandfather and my Italian grandmother, and so I think all of that helped neutralize my accent. But ultimately, the way, and tell me if I'm wrong, but the way I see it, had they not been able to speak such good English in general, they probably wouldn't have been able to correspond through those letters and eventually become married. And I think, but ultimately, the hardest part about making this story real is that back when my Mexican grandmother was a girl, her parents, her Mexican parents, were smart enough to think, if our kids are going to get ahead as basically, first generation kids here in America, we need to make sure that their own language doesn't set them back. Now, granted, it would be nice for me to have learned how to speak Spanish from her, but ultimately, if her English wasn't so good as it was, then there's a good chance I wouldn't be here. So that's my theory. I exist ultimately because my Mexican grandmother was forced to speak English only in the house, and because my Italian grandfather, his mother passed away when she was young, and so he was raised in an orphanage. Maybe that part wasn't so crucial to the story, but making sure that my grandma only spoke English in the house, I think, was crucial to ultimately the trickle-down effect of Nick Shell being born. What do you think? Thanks for watching the video. Leave comments. Hopefully you find this story interesting, because I'm full of stories. I just got to know that people care about my stories so I can know what to do my videos about. Thanks for watching.